Susan and I are so excited to be here today to talk to you a little bit about some of the experiential learning programs that we have at Rutgers, but more importantly, how do we adapt these programs now in this new virtual world we live in? Because these are critical programs to learning, so we don't want to just drop them, but we do have to get a little creative in how we adapt them. So a little bit about me. I have a bachelor's degree in chemistry and got my PhD in biomedical engineering from Rutgers, where I now work. I actually started my career in industry, so that's what makes my position at Rutgers unique, and that's what makes me a professor of practice, is that my training comes from a practical career path of industry versus a track record of grant writing and publications. So that's the skill set that I bring to the students. I was also very interested in the management side. I didn't want to just have a career at the bench, so I pursued my executive MBA. But throughout my entire career, I was always interested in teaching and mentoring and preparing that next generation of scientists for the real world. So as was said, I'm a professor of practice in the biomedical engineering department, and just this month I was appointed as the undergraduate program director. So even though I'm in academia, I have a very industry type role. So I bring industry into the classroom. I teach, I mentor, I run programs like a co-op program. I help our senior design leader, who you're going to hear from later in our panel, with our senior design program. We'll talk about what that is. And basically, I focus on helping students with an interest in industry and help provide tools that can help them. Now, I'll let my colleague Susan tell you a little bit about her.
So please don't do the math, but I graduated Columbia University in 1983. Here's where the chats say, you don't look that old, come on. My career is really a strange path. If I were to look back at it, I would say, wow, that was really well coordinated or well organized, but I didn't do it on purpose. I really started back in 83 at Bell Labs, AT&T Bell Labs, for those of you who remember that. Thank you, Amy. And she said, you look fabulous. And started in technology, computer science, were the first ones to play around with fiber optics, la. And then at some point, and did a lot of consulting, you know, from technology, then to systems engineering and software engineering, actually software engineering, then systems engineering and process engineering. I was kind of always trying to pick my head up from the lab saying, okay, but why? Why are we doing this? What's its relevance? And at some point I kind of took a turn and got into the business end of things. I worked for Deloitte. I was a senior manager there. Bear Stearns, managing director. I was really the person that translated the technology for the technology people, what the business wanted and vice versa. So I always had an affinity for that. Started at Rutgers about 15 years ago, and started the Civit organization, which really was intended to help people commercialize their technology, help faculty commercialize their technology. So what does that mean? Taking it from I invented this, isn't it cool, to why do you think it's cool? Why does anybody else think it's cool, etc. And in the interim, we really ended up making it more of an educational center where we do a lot of experiential learning, a lot of experiential training. The programs that you see there are ones that I was specifically involved with, and we'll talk about some of them today. Next slide, Kay. I'm just going to call her Kay, it's easier. Okay, so experiential learning, what does that mean? Tell me and I forget, teach me and I remember, involve me and I learn. You know, I have to say, I remember in Columbia, typical classroom with, you know, the stadium seating, and I had a physics teacher that would stand there, and just if you watched him, you understood what he was doing. He would do strange things up there before class started. So just to be really simple about it, if it was a lesson about physics, he would drop things. I mean, that's silly. You know, he would do more complicated things up there. He was showing us what it really meant. What is it, instead of just an equation, he's going to show us what's really happening here. Experiential learning. He was a man ahead of his time. It's where theory meets action, and it really facilitates student learning. We all know it. We all know that when we really, you know, see something happening, we are able to internalize it. We're never going to forget it, especially when we understand its meaning in life, rather than just, I'm studying it for the test and that's it, and then I forget it. There are a lot of experiential programs within Rutgers. Kristen and I are going to talk about a couple of them today. The initial focus of this back before COVID, I think, was about experiential learning, but now it's experiential learning in a remote environment. So we'll talk to you a bit about the programs that we run, and we'll talk a little bit about the challenges and what we've seen what are possible changes to that in a remote environment? Next slide. So another quote, because there are so many about this, a picture's worth 1,000 words, right? One fact, back in 1858, by the way, one fact well understood by observation and well-guided development is worth 1,000 times more than 1,000 words. Well-guided development, right? If you see something, but you don't have an opportunity to internalize that, again, it might go in and out. But the fact that with a lot of our programming, and the two that are mentioned here are the ones that I'll go through, are paired with having the students think about it, having them, we'll talk about, but having them keep logs, having them take what they've learned and translate it in some way, a case study, something, really, really works. Next slide. So we'll talk first about iJobs. iJobs is the Interdisciplinary Job Opportunities for Biomedical Scientists program. We call it iJobs, and it is a program that was started by the NIH about, let's see, we're in our 6th year, we were the second, about 7 years ago. What happened was they did a study, and they saw that 70% of PhD graduates pursuing non-academic career options, and they were unprepared to do so. They just figured all PhD students are going to be attached to the bench for the rest of their lives. They're going to do research. They're PIs, they're investigators, their bosses, so to speak, in the lab certainly wanted them to stay. They weren't being encouraged to do anything else, but those jobs weren't there in academia. They realized they had to do something. So they put out a grant request, a grant proposal, RFP, blah, blah, blah. 17 universities were awarded that grant. It was a 5-year program, and it was specifically for pre-docs and postdocs. I say that, but it applies to every single class standing. It applies to undergraduates and so on, and should really be extended. Our program, actually, we reached out to Princeton, NJIT, Stevens, and Rowan within New Jersey and involved them in our program as well. And the program is 4-phased. In the first phase, we give them all kinds of programming about what careers are out there, what's possible, what's available, they don't even know, right? Second phase, they really start to work on, what do I want to do as a career? What do I want to pursue? Third phase, they go ahead and implement it. We help them find jobs. And the fourth phase, they come back as alum. Next slide. So I'm going to talk to you about a couple of things that we do within that program that are experiential in nature. One is site visits. You might say, yeah, we all have site visits. It's experiential. What's special? What's great about it is that it is customized to our particular program. So the students really go there and they don't say, okay, this is Pfizer or this is Colgate, and they'll give you a little package of toothbrushes as you leave and, all of that, right? We go to companies that are that are involved in everything that those students can be involved in a career. And they really customize a program for us. So we get, of course, the facility tour, but we see hold on, my phone's ringing. We see the specific labs, and it's very, pertinent to those students. And we get an understanding of what the career types are for that particular student, for a PhD student, for a fellow, for a post doc, right? Within that company. So we see a variety of roles and so on. You might think COVID, I guess the site visit stopped, but no, we're doing them remotely. Facility tours are substituted by images of labs and working spaces. And the great news is that breakout rooms are just so much more diverse, right? You can have people in different geographical settings that are in those breakout rooms. You can come back and share. You can have our things used to sell out. You get the thing on Eventbrite, it's gone 2 minutes later, right? Everybody signed up. And we capped it at like 30, 40 students. Now we can have 100. We can have so much more. No transportation costs and so on and so forth. Next slide. iJob simulations. This is another thing that we do that's fantastic. You learn about equity research, these are really life sciences students, but let me pick another one. You learn about science policy. Fine, we'll get you together. You'll write a policy memo. You'll actually do the work, right? Publishing, you will decide, go through the ruminations, the research, the surveying, whatever you have to do to write, to decide whether to accept a manuscript. You're living it, right? And you can keep on going. There are role plays, medical informaticist versus a medical science liaison. What's the difference? You do role plays. These are concepts and I can't think of the word right now because it's Friday. These are ideas. These are ways to do things, ways to do experiential learning that you can absolutely adapt to your own areas. And we've continued to do this because this is also possible remotely. There's no reason why not to do that. Next slide, please. iJob shadowing and mentoring. So we recognize that, you know, I may say, you know what, I think I want to be a medical science liaison. Why not? It sounds cool. Let's go do that. We assign, in the second phase, we assign each student a shadow host and a mentor. The mentor is the person that actually sits with them and goes through their individual development plan, which is very important. It's an industry person that's involved in the career that they're pursuing, right? And they help them through their individual development plan. The shadow host is the person, for example, if it were Pfizer, I don't mean to pick on an individual company, Acme company, right? They actually bring the student in for 72 hours over a semester. And it depends on we're very respectful of their schedules. And they shadow them. They go to meetings, and it's not just about the meeting and what's discussed, it's about the politics, it's about the different organizations, how they work together, it's all of that. And sometimes they turn around and they say to me, you know, I like it, but I don't love it. I don't think I want to do that. Maybe there's something else. And then I'll assign them a different shadow. It can't go on forever. I mean, my time is limited, but you know, I might assign them another shadowing opportunity. So when they cross the threshold, when they finally get a job, they don't sit there and say, oh my God, this isn't at all what I thought I wanted to do. And it's experiential. They are there with the professional experiencing what it's like to be in that particular role. And I mentioned before, you need to document that. You need to get in the map with it. We ask them to observe the daily routine. We ask them to log. They have to log what they've seen, what the reaction to it is, how they're going to use that in their development plan. And this is all reviewed by the mentor. So they actually do, you know, integrate it into what they're doing. Next slide, please. These are just some representative comments, you know, from trainees. I got to talk with, and you could read what's going on here. I got to talk with many people across various functions and now understand. I have a better grasp of the field of patent law and look forward to using this knowledge. I mean, these are there are a million of them. I didn't have time to put all them on here, but the comments that we get are just fantastic. The students it's better than any class they could ever take. And and by the way, we do also allow them to take a class in the area that they're interested in. And one of the things they tell us is not, oh my goodness, it was so great to learn all of this. They say, it was great to hang with the students that are involved in this major. So if a student is interested in patent law and they take a class in the law school on patent law, they hang with the law students. So even though they're not going to get a JD, they want to be involved as maybe the subject matter expert or what have you, they now understand a little bit of the culture. So that's another, I didn't put that up here, but that's another area where we do experiential learning. Next slide, please. This is just a real quick view of where our students have gotten jobs. So they come out of this, I mean, I'm just saying it works. It really works because it's like a good housekeeping seal of approval. The companies understand that we do this. They seek the iJob students because they've got this experiential learning and they've been successful. It's just really working. It's fabulous. Next slide, please. And this is just, I couldn't even fit them all on. I mean, I don't mean to brag. The point is that we live in New Jersey. So in the work that we're doing with life sciences, we've got the contacts here, but if you really look closely, you see that it's also Ogilvy, which is an advertising firm in the city, in New York City. It's also, you know, I don't know, I'm looking here. It's also, there are other ones here I can't find. NPR, which is you know, it's also Wiley Publishing, which is publishing, right? They get subject matter expert jobs it's not just life sciences. They really understand now, what can I be with this degree? Next slide, please. So the other thing that I wanted to talk about is healthcare clinical immersion. It's another program that we run, and it's for undergrads. So that kind of balances it a little bit. I take the undergrads into the operating rooms. So what does that really mean? First of all, it's not just that. It's a program where they have to, it's over winter vacation so that it's not taking away from their class time. They have to first do some research to understand, what does it mean to have a gap in patient care? What does it mean to have a gap in healthcare? So they start to understand a little bit about innovation and entrepreneurship and what it means to really seek look at where the problems are and then go to fix those. You know, look, we're professors. What is our duty? Our duty is to give the students everything that we possibly can so that they can be successful, and we can we can be proud later on. And of course, they can come back and donate lots of money to the school, but that's besides the point. They do some online assignments, and then we do some demonstrations. They go into mobile health. They understand, what does the dispatch center look like? They go on an ambulance and they see that, my God, if I'm going to develop a new defibrillator, it has to fit on an ambulance. Maybe I have other things to take into account, right? And then they finally do clinical shadowing. So they actually are scrubbed in. They're not scrubbed in like where they're doing surgery, don't worry. They're actually in scrubs, right? They're not scrubbed in, actually, they're in scrubs, right? And they're in the operating rooms watching procedures. If I tell you the comments I get back from students are like, oh my God, I was this close to a human brain. I will never have the opportunity to do that ever again. And Kristen Anderson, who's on the panel, can attest to it later on. It's a fantastic program. And they say that they've gotten perspective that they never could have gotten elsewhere. So if we go to the next slide, you see that these are the surgical disciplines. And I don't even think that's updated, right? There are probably more. And then they do clinical rotations. They go through rotations with gastro, with interventional radiology, with pathology. They go to pathology in the afternoons to help diagnose or help look at the tissue that was taken out of the patient in the surgery that they shadowed in the morning. It's just an unbelievable. And they also do operations engineering. They follow around the people that actually fix the defibrillators and fix the whatever else, right? So they get an understanding from an engineering perspective. Next slide, please. This is just an example of the logging that we do, right? They have to event observed, observation and effect on the system, recommendation or implementation, and any notes. And then they have to take that and submit an essay. We make sure that they actually cement it in, not just experience it, but cement it, right? That picture at the beginning doesn't show there's the experience and then you're there. It says reflect on it, then immerse a little bit more, and and then feed off of it. Next slide. These are just some comments from the students, and I have hundreds of them. I took this slide from a previous one actually, and there might even be better ones, but this is what the students are saying. They absolutely love it. They gain insight, right? And those are two programs, just two, that we're involved with, where we're doing experiential learning. Unfortunately, the clinical immersion one probably won't survive COVID this year because they're not going to be allowed into the hospital. I mean, I doubt it, but we will probably do something that can at least do some of the rotations remotely. So I'm going to turn it over to Kristen. I hope that I haven't, I don't know how much time I've used.
You're
Kristen,
good.
and she's going to talk about her programming.
All right, thank you, Susan.
You're welcome.
So another very important experiential learning program we have is our senior design program, which is very common in engineering schools. It's in BME, biomedical engineering. It's a 2-semester course that has a weekly seminar and a capstone project where the students are tasked with identifying a problem or some challenge and proposing a solution, sharing scientific details, and if appropriate, create a prototype, and then describe how their product addresses the voice of customer. So it's basically the culmination and integration of 3 years of courses where they learn those technical and interpersonal skills and also various engineering principles. So senior design is critical. This is for students who might not have gotten in the lab yet. This is the first time that they're going to be working on their own research project. It's in a team. They have to learn teamwork. And to not have that continue, it's critical. So when we went remote in the spring, the students had to adapt. They were maybe like 80% done at that point. So they were kind of able to finish what they had started, at least remotely. And it was a very collaborative effort. Students did what they could do at home with a hammer and a piece of wood and an electrical wire. But it wasn't ideal. So this is a very critical program that we have. So biomedical engineering is an extremely diverse field of engineering. It touches on so many different areas of science and technology. There's stem cell research, artificial organs, biosensors, imaging, prostheses, wheelchairs. All of these modules are part of BME. So the projects reflect that diversity. So we have students working on things like low-cost microfluidics, 3D printing new materials from, we have this robotic polymer machine in the lab, computational analysis of gene expression. So for the students who are more computer oriented, we have computational projects. Students who are interested in like wound healing, we have projects around wound healing, nanoparticles for soft tissue repair, We have a robotic venipuncture device that's actually in a clinical trial. So students lined up to volunteer to have a robot draw blood from their arm. So really, really cool, innovative research going on. And again, this is where the students get the hands-on experience. However, one of the hallmarks of being a biomedical engineer is, unlike the other engineering disciplines like mechanical, chemical, electrical, which may touch on a therapy or something to help a patient, everything in biomedical engineering hits a patient. So now we're trying to think, well, we have to give students that exposure and that experience. They're working on therapies and devices and, you know, better imaging to detect diseases sooner. It all goes to help people. How do we get them involved with the people? And so we started incorporating what we call patient-centric projects, and that interest has pretty much doubled since we've implemented that program. So this now, continuing on the clinical immersion that Susan mentioned, which is instruction based on extensive exposure to surroundings or conditions native to the object of study, we took that idea to the, not only out of just in the clinic, but out of the clinic as well, and thinking how biomedical engineers do this amazing work, creating really cool, innovative therapies. Like I said, stem cells, artificial organs. This is cool stuff. These devices can be life-changing to those with diseases or disabilities. However, most research, and it's not just engineers, it's really any scientist, most research gets done behind the scenes, and the researcher has a little opportunity to see those who benefit from those advances in healthcare. So there appears to be a gap between the researcher and the end user. The engineer is doing what they think is technically best, but really they need to find out what the end user's needs are. And so we're trying to use now this patient-centric immersion program to close that gap. So what we wanted to do was incorporate an immersion experience to bridge the gap between the biomedical engineer and the end user in order to improve the quality of research and the outcoming products. So we want to take these young engineering minds, you know, they think very differently, they're engineers, they're problem solvers, put them in an environment where their creativity can be stimulated. Let them observe the problem firsthand and then use their unique way of thinking. They might see something that a layperson doesn't see. So we've partnered, our first partner was the Matheny Medical and Educational Center, which is a facility for very severely disabled individuals. And then again, as this interest grew, we've had to bring on more partners. We then partnered with Operation Rebound, which is an organization for disabled athletes. And both of these have brought very different experiences to the students. And we have people from Matheny with us today who are going to be on our panel in a few minutes. So what this immersion does is, and I'm using an MBA term, bringing into factor the voice of the customer. And the customer at Matheny could be the patient, or as they're called, their clients. It could be the doctors, it could be the educators, because it's a hospital and a school. So you have the doctor's perspective, you have the educator's perspective. It could be the aides who are doing the routine work like bathing and feeding, but what are their challenges? Their challenges are going to be different from the educator, different from the doctor. The occupational therapist, the speech pathologist, how do you communicate with someone who's nonverbal and maybe they can't use their hands to push a button? It can get very complicated. So all of those contribute a very different perspective, and therefore the students are getting more well-rounded feedback for product improvement. So when they go to immerse at Matheny, they're learning everything from HIPAA, which is something now we have to think about in this remote world particularly. They're looking at arts access, they're observing feeding, transportation, they're talking to the physical therapist, the occupational therapist, they're sitting in the classrooms, they're learning about communication devices. So they're really getting a good exposure to all the different elements at Matheny. So some of the ideas that have come out, a lot of them focus on wheelchairs because most of the population at Matheny is wheelchair bound. So wheelchairs are a big focus of our students. How can you improve degrees of freedom and visual field? The students are also looking though at the caregivers and coming up with devices that could help them, such as a retractable IV pole or something to crush pills, because the nurses are crushing thousands of pills because they have to be put into feeding tubes in a lot of cases. So how do you streamline that process? How do you avoid contamination? Again, because people are in wheelchairs for most of their day, can you make more comfortable wheelchair cushions? Can you incorporate sensors that will alarm for maybe if the client is immobile for a long period of time, you want to prevent bed sores. Manipulatives for adults that have an underdeveloped mental capacity, but the strength of an adult. So you don't want them putting a toy in their mouth and they bite off a piece and they could choke. These are things you have to think about, and you wouldn't think of this unless you were observing this at Matheny. So this here is just a little example video. This here is a video of two students who create, these are two students, the team was 4, creating a dynamic headrest. The purpose of this headrest was if someone couldn't turn their own neck, they could operate it by pushing a button, okay? So that's version 1.0. Great idea, someone who can't turn their neck, but they can operate it pushing a button. So that's what they're doing. Venki's pushing the button and Matt is being turned with the neck rest. But now let me challenge you a little bit more. What if the person doesn't have hand control and they can't push a button? Okay, so version 2.0, the group came up with the idea of putting sensors in the neck rest so that when they tap on the headrest, it'll turn. But now let me throw a third challenge at you. What if that patient has a seizure disorder? So now you have to factor in, now you have to put a control in that so that the headrest can distinguish between intentional tapping, I want to turn my neck, to, uh-oh, this is a seizure, don't turn, we don't want the person being jostled anymore. So this is why observing people is so critical, because you could see how that could change very quickly. Very quickly, I mentioned Operation Operation Rebound. We just started this year, so some of the projects that came out of that are wheelchair assist devices. So if the user falls out of the chair, now these people have a little bit more mobility, so some of them drive cars. So it expands the ideas of projects that we can do. Grapplers to help with reaching, modular wheelchair trays, and one team worked on a foldable bike for one of these gentleman who was racing, but he had trouble getting his bike and his wheelchair in his van before driving off. So they put a little device so that it could be broken down into 2 pieces. And one of our favorite stories to tell is with Eric LeGrand, who is in New Jersey, a little bit of a celebrity. He was a former Rutgers football star who suffered a spinal cord injury during a football game, which rendered him paralyzed from the neck down. So Eric is an example of a group of students who made a project that was so simple, but it was life-changing. You don't have to always grow organs or make things out of stem cells. Sometimes it's as simple as creating a stylus holder. So you could see in the picture on the bottom corner, Eric, he's paralyzed from the neck down, so he can't use his hands or anything, but he could turn his head. And so he uses a stylus to operate his cell phone. But he had nowhere to put his stylus when he was done using it. And it was drying out his throat, it was impeding his speech, it was bothering his mother. So the students decided, they made measurements of the stylus and his wheelchair. They didn't want to put any more bulk that didn't need to be there because Eric already has a lot going on. They designed and 3D printed the prototype, they tested and modified the design, they 3D printed a final version. They gave it to Eric, who was extremely happy and basically said that this was a life-changing device that we presented him with. So a few pennies and some plastic, and we created something that changed this young man's life and gave him just a little bit more independence that he didn't have before. So like Susan showed, this research is very important to the students. They became biomedical engineers because they want to spend their life creating things to better the lives of those in need. The immersion gave them the opportunity to connect with patients. One student loved sports and was an athlete, so she wanted to use her professional and hobby interests to work. And then Eric just really impacted so many people's lives. He really was very inspiring to work with. So that's a nice little background on our programs. We've set the stage. So now I'd like to introduce our panelists. We have from the Matheny School, we have Mr. Sean Murphy, who's the Vice President of Education and the Principal and Director. Mr. Alex Frauman, who's the Information Technology Coordinator. Technology is what it's all about in a remote virtual world, right? So Alex's perspective will be interesting. We have Dr. Jay Tsai, Assistant Professor from Rutgers, who leads our Senior Design Program. Alex Burr, who's a PhD student who participated in the shadowing program. From Robert Wood Johnson, we have Dr. Kristen Anderson, Assistant Professor of Surgery, colorectal surgeon, and the Director of the Surgical Skills Lab, who's also participated in the clinical immersion with Susan. And from Cellularity, Dr. Irene Reitman Kutorskoy. I'm sorry if I botched your name. She's a research scientist who participated on the industry side for the shadowing. So I think we are ready to, maybe I'll stop sharing my screen so everyone can see our lovely panel. And we could ask some questions. So Susan, should I get started with some questions?
Absolutely. And then we'll have a little Q&A at the end.
Wonderful. So I guess what we want to know is basically, to start off, what specifically is your role in experiential learning, and what changes have you experienced in your individual environments due to the COVID pandemic? How did you shift or adapt these training environments to adhere to new requirements?
Okay, you want me to start?
Go for it, Sean.
Okay, so at Matheny, my role is I'm Vice President of Education for the hospital. So I help run all the intern programs, even for OT, PT, speech. And there's been a problem, as Kristen stated, that in the hospitals, they don't allow people in right now. I mean, we just unfortunately had another case of COVID identified in the hospital today. And so we always have to adapt. Last year, we could do in person, but now all the training, professional development is via Zoom. And you wonder, how can you observe into the classrooms if there's no classrooms in session? And so what we've done is we've pivoted away from the hospital to some extent, and we've engaged the parents at home and said, can we join your sessions? How many parents will sign up for this opportunity? So we'll still do the training. We'll still have Zoom sessions like this where our professionals can demonstrate some of the work that they'll be able to do, but not so much in classroom settings. Mm-hmm. Maybe downstairs in the DME, show some of the functionality, and with the therapist working in the home virtually along with the parents demonstrating. Because, you know, a lot of our staff, when we got hit by 32% COVID rate in the hospital, and when we were at that level, all visitation was stopped, and even visitation, because we're kind of identified as a long-term care facility, and so there wasn't any rec therapy, music therapy, arts access to actually observe. And so we have to like pivot and say, how can we best address these needs? And how do we bridge that gap with the agreements with the parents? Because there's one thing that I heard both the main presenters say, both Susan and Dr. Labarzo, it's about people. It's about connectivity. It's about connections. One of the best things that we were able to do when we trained the Rutgers students as staff first before they even go in with the immersion and before they talk. And so we loaded them onto the buses. They got to see how the ratchets worked, how the chairs were fastened, all the intricacies, so that this way they fully understand the problem. And so it's been an adventure. Luckily, Alex and I are just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to Matheny. We have a whole technology committee that is cross-discipline, and we've been looking to see how we can legally still open it up to be virtually experiential. Alex, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'd be happy to. Thank you for everyone attending. I appreciate it, by the way. Yeah, definitely. It's an unprecedented times, right? For all of us. I mean, last year having the Rutgers students in, it's one of my favorite programs, honestly. And we have a couple with different universities, but having the undergrads come in and work and sit side by side with our patients and our students in our classrooms. It's an amazing partnership to see. And I'm really hoping, like Sean said, to foster it continuously with what we're faced with now, which is, quite frankly, using Zoom or FaceTime or other mediums to be able to communicate those things. But that's the important part, is the communication. I think that everyone here and the people who are part of watching all this, we're even contacting our family like this, right? At least I was, and friends from afar. And so I think that communication is going to be a huge piece. I think that the technology role is a huge piece as well. So I think that there's a little bit more understanding now of bring your own device, for instance. That used to be a huge absolute no-no. I know my children, for instance, in high school, my daughter just graduated, and they would have to go into a classroom and put their phones in a little basket, right? I don't foresee that to happen much longer. I see that, technology is being embraced as a learning tool. We all have these tools in our hands. The kids that we care for or whatever, they all grew up with it in their hands. So I think that idea has changed. And I think it's going to really foster the growth with the opportunities that are left.
Thank you, Alex. I'm just curious, Kristen, what's going on in the hospital? I mean, that's kind of a bigger setting for the kinds of things that both Sean and Alex were talking about.
So in the hospital, the residents have probably, their experiential learning has not been impacted in the hospital as much, because as essential workers, they're essentially still doing the same things that they had been doing before the pandemic. The medical students, however, for a period of time, I think from March to June, were not allowed in the hospital for their own safety, but also due to limitations in personal protective equipment. So they had an issue where essentially they had the third and fourth years. Third and fourth year of medical school is traditionally essentially full immersion in the hospital, and they went from a program that was designed for that to not being in the hospital at all, and so the medical school's been adapting.
And I know that you, in your role specifically with training, I know that you kind of play a dual role for the clinical immersion thing. We talked a bit about how that's been adapted and what are some of the things that you're working on?
Yeah, so that's actually been very interesting. So simulation, so as many of you may or may not know, for surgical training, basically to become a surgeon, you go through 4 years of medical school, and then you essentially immerse yourself in surgery, shadowing surgeons living in the hospital, helping to take care of patients. We have in surgery tried to actually move that a little bit more remotely, and had a simulation where we tried to figure out how we could teach surgeries and procedures effectively to learners without having them learn on patients, essentially, so they can learn before they got to the patient, so they already had a certain degree of skill prior to interacting with the patients. So simulation was actually something that has been a great passion of mine, but that was unfortunately negatively affected by COVID initially, because essentially the basics of simulation involve a lot of people in a small room in very close proximity, and that sort of didn't work with the pandemic. So as they say, with every challenge comes opportunity, and we actually started looking at seeing if there was a way we could do simulation remotely. So I've sort of touched on the challenges of simulation during a pandemic, but even without a pandemic, there's certain challenges, and probably the big challenge is time. Surgeons are busy. Surgical residents have limited time, and traditionally in simulation, we've essentially tried to get maybe 7 surgeons together with 30 residents for a few hours during the week, but this is actually a pretty limited amount of time, and it's also very expensive time in that everybody else has a lot of other things they could be doing in this time. So what we've been trying to do is, in partnership with UCSF in California, develop a program where the residents could be learning virtually. So for example, if they're learning to tie a knot, they'd have a video, they'd watch a video of knot tying broken down into different steps. And then they would actually submit a video to the teachers, the educators, who would have a very standardized way of assessing their skill development. And actually, we're actually even going further in having them then learn to assess themselves and learn to assess each other. And there's, I think, a lot of really exciting implications of this. One, your teachers could be in a completely different area. So somebody from England could teach somebody in New Jersey or something of that sort. So it kind of gets rid of some of the distance barriers. And then also another exciting idea is if the learners can learn to assess each other, then maybe you don't need a master surgeon for all of the tasks. Maybe you could get people a little bit more readily available. And then my sort of personal passion is the next level, the sort of the holy grail, is to allow learners to learn to assess themselves and then develop activities or tasks to improve their skill set and then reassess. So essentially learn how to teach yourself, because if you could do that, you've really empowered the learner. And so, I think that there have been a lot of challenges with this pandemic, but I think it actually has forced us to think creatively and potentially really push things forward for us.
In other words, I should invest in more nice pajamas because I don't think I'm ever going to get out of them. Thank you, Kristen. So I'd like to turn it over to Alex and Irene. They were not on the same. Irene is from Cellularity. Alex shadowed in a different company, in GeneWiz. So I'd like to just maybe start with either one. I don't really, it doesn't matter, but I'd like to get an understanding of, I guess with Alex, right? What was it like shadowing? What did you gain from it? And you've done it, remotely now for a bit. What are the differences? And then we'll turn to Irene and then perhaps to Q&A.
Sure. So yeah, I did my shadowing and mentoring through iJobs this past semester, and I started out in person before COVID. So I was at GeneWiz in the lab at the facility with, meeting a lot of other people every day. And I think when switching to virtual, it was really nice of my shadow host to set up informational interviews for me with other colleagues of hers so I could learn about their roles and how they're similar or different from hers. And one positive outcome of that was I learned I actually don't want to do project management. I'm not interested in that as a career path. So I think, like you said, sometimes, you learn more about what you don't like before you do what you do like. But I think one thing I really enjoyed about the virtual experience is that the conversations I ended up having with those folks over Zoom were so much more broad and overall career focused. I think because in stepping outside the lab, it felt way easier to ask questions about the big picture rather than just focusing on the day-to-day.
Great perspective. Again, the pajama thing. Okay. Irene, can we hear from you? So you had served as a shadow host for Brianna, and what was that experience like? And I know that with you, the virtual is, a little bit more difficult. So tell us about that, if you would. Thank you.
So I pretty much spent most of my time in the lab doing various experiments. We're in a cell therapy group, so I work with cells, doing a lot of in vitro work, also interact with some other teams like process development, translational. So it's very much in the lab. So, Brianna, she started shadowing about, I think it was early March. So I wish, or maybe end of February. So, wish we knew that this was coming so she could have started earlier. But I think she only got to basically come maybe twice before, we sort of had to stop because even like, the Rutgers as a whole stopped the iJob shadowing. So she basically lost out on that in-person lab component. So she's still, she's able to attend the meetings. I every time we have a meeting, either our group meeting or our bigger R&D meeting. I send her the Skype link so she can join the meetings that way, and so she can see us discuss the research, discuss the science, can see how it works in terms of like, people like contributing ideas, suggestions, even just sort of the interaction that, the scientists have with upper management and things like that. So, in that sense, she can still, hear that through the Skype meeting. But I think the big part that she's missing out on is the lab part. So she doesn't get to see my day-to-day, basically, the science work that I do, how it works with the collaborative environment we have with other science teams, how the work gets distributed. So all of that, unfortunately, she just doesn't get anymore to see. And so I feel like if for somebody who wants to go into industry as a scientist, not to be able to participate in that is losing out on a lot of that experiential part. Right now I actually, because in Solera we have an intern program, and so I actually have an intern this summer, and so I actually decided to still go ahead with their intern program. So we have the interns on site now, and I'm really happy for my intern that he's still able to come this summer, because he gets to have that experiential lab component to it. He gets to see all the work, and he's doing some work himself. So I think he's getting twofold. He's getting the sort of the hands-on learning of an experience of being in a lab, but also seeing what kind of how it is that in an industry setting you work in a lab with other people.
Yeah, it's interesting. What I'm hearing is that it really does depend on your own environment. I mean, we heard from Sean and Alex about how walk a mile in my shoes is so important. I mean, because of the patients that you see, your clientele, their situation, you have to be it. You have to see it. You have to feel it. You have to ride on the bus. You have to be in a wheelchair. You have to live it to understand really what their needs are. Alex and Irene, it matters what you're doing, right? I mean, it matters if you're in the lab, it's one thing. If you're, it also depends on the company culture, right? So if you're not meeting intensive, or if you just have status meetings, but generally you do stuff on your own, or, what's revealed in meetings, because those are things you can easily pop in on. And a lot of it depends on the culture. And it sounds like at the hospital, we can use a lot. I mean, peer-to-peer, we can, what, Kay, I call her Kay, we can just not teach, just have our students teach each other. There's an idea. But seriously, necessity is the mother of invention. And that's a great idea. Why not? Send in videos. I mean, we do, so I hope that the attendees on the phone here on Zoom can take those seed ideas and extract from them, both from the panelists as well as from what we have discussed. I know there were some questions about the slides and stuff. We'll make some version of them certainly available to folks. It is now 6:35. We have 10 minutes, and I don't know whether there have been questions.
I'd like to let Jay speak. We haven't heard from Jay.
Oh, Jay, I'm sorry, Jay. You're not in my purview on my thing. I forgot. I
no worries.
About you, Jay. I'm sorry. Thank you, Jay.
No problem. So in my role, in this topic, I instruct the senior design, which is our capstone program. And ironically, I think in a sense, we actually forced our students to go back to basics. So, we were thinking about, the biggest impact that we had for our students was the fact that they lost access to these really well outfitted labs where they could do experimentation, they could, fabricate things with 3D printers and such. So I think it was interesting to see a lot of the resourcefulness that our engineering students were able to really tap into. So if they didn't have calibrated weights, they would use things like, pennies and nickels and use that as a weight for trying to do things like that. People were using kitchen scales instead of, Instron machines that cost $50, $60, $70, $100,000. So going back to basics was a big thing for us. It's really, how do you almost MacGyver the experiments that you're not able to do since you no longer have access to stuff in class. So that's kind of one comment I wanted to make. And just to be a little bit brief, the other thing that I saw shift with my students was giving them the skills to actually produce videos. So a big component of the senior design is presentations, being able to convey your ideas to the class And really what they did was really became a lot more proficient at making videos. So I'll cut it short there. I'm sure, hopefully we'll have some questions with other people that are trying to run courses like this.
Yeah, I want to say also, it's interesting. So we also run a program called RISE. I forgot, what is it? Rutgers. Anyway, it's a program for students that are the first college graduates and their families and so on and so forth. And one of the things they did, because they've got to work on a research project as well, is they worked on data analysis programs, right? So there's still, senior design is coming on us, right? It's coming upon us. It's going to start in the fall. What's going to happen, right? Maybe the projects become different projects, things that can be done at home for the, let's say 85% of it and 50% of it is some other hands-on experience that they would benefit from. So yeah, we're a pretty resilient bunch. I mean, the fact that we have really made it through this.
And just to, I don't see any questions in the Q&A yet, but a few people did comment about some of the positives that came out of this experience. So Dr. Anderson mentioned the removal of geographic restrictions. So now you think okay, we can bring in guest speakers from the other side of the country or from another country. It opens up our pool of candidates for educating our students. Jay mentioned the getting creative, we're engineers. So fundamentally we should figure out how to solve problems with what we're given. And that's what the seniors had to do from home. By opening the immersion with Matheny virtually, maybe the students are going to see things that they would never have seen before. So observing a student in their home and how, now that opens up a whole other pool of projects. Now you're watching students do remote learning. Maybe the engineers are going to identify a new challenge, okay, well, how can we improve the remote learning for this disabled student from home? It's now the possibilities branch out even more. So does anyone else have any other comments on positives that came out of this that were not already mentioned?
I just have to mention one thing, Kristen, and that is Jay hit the nail on the head on some respects with regards to going back to basics. There is a lot of what Sean and I are doing with regards to Matheny, the school, the parents, our therapists, our teachers, all of it. And going back to the basics, Jay, you really did hit the nail on the head with that. There is a lot of that. There was a lot of focus on what new thing we could do, right? And that kind of has changed. And it's the new thing that we can do, but how it's going to affect, like Sean said, and you just did articulated, that it's going to be a kid in their home environment, and how it is affecting to a parent. I mean, I know as a caregiver or working in a technology role in a hospital, it definitely has a different perspective. But like I said, Jay hit the nail on the head, going back to the basics and seeing it from a different view.
And I think as we're preparing for the coming school year, I think part of that is reevaluating what we want to get across to students. So, I think just acknowledging the situation, right? So when students were sent home just prior to spring break, we knew that they would not have as sophisticated data collection or projects or whatever. What we pushed them to do is to understand what could have been done, where are the ways they could have improved it, but also just acknowledge how much they could do with the lack of resources. So just acknowledging that the world is different and the expectations should also change to be different as well.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things.
Go ahead.
One of the things that we found, and this is the other hat, it's how do you make internships for professionals like speech therapists, like OTs, virtual? That's one of the challenges that we've been exploring as a team. I mean, the virtual Rutgers bioengineering students, easy, but how do you bridge that gap? Because a lot of our interns come from other states. And while New Jersey might be allowed to do teletherapy and telepresence and supervision over that is another thing that is going to absolutely change education, both at the K-12 level and at the higher level, the higher education level. Like, for example, right now we're looking at sending, possibly once we get DOE approval, paraprofessionals out to people's homes to help with range of motion while being supervised by clinical professionals, the OTs, PTs, and the teachers through Zoom. And we're having to change the laws in order to make things happen, because we cannot accept staying with the status quo, because who knows when the next blip is going to occur that'll affect everyone, and we need to be continuing to move forward.
Alex, Alex Burr, did you have something to say?
I was just going to say, from the student perspective, I think one benefit that the pandemic had on experiential learning particularly was it kind of pushed students, I saw this both in myself and with my mentees, to advocate for themselves more so. You have to say, like, hey, this style of virtual learning isn't working for me. Can we make sure we meet face to face at least once a week? Or now we don't have the hands-on tools to be showing the students in lab, and you just have to say, oh, I need you to draw this out, and we need to get on Zoom, and we need to look at slides when we do this. And it's, I think, taking your learning in your own hands a little bit more than you normally have to, because things aren't as cookie cutter as they used to be.
So we have like 2 minutes left. Are there any burning questions from the audience? A quiet crowd. I know it's late for us on the East Coast.
Our contact information is in the presentation.
Oh wait, I have that. Yeah, let me pull that up again real quick.
Yeah, if you can bring that up, Kay, that would be great. So feel free. We'd love to talk more about it. We'd love to answer questions that you have, help you to work through some of these things if you'd like to implement them at your own schools. And and cool beans, as they say. We wish everyone a wonderful weekend.
Yes,
and
thank you. Thanks to all of our panelists for bringing your perspective. It's been very interesting. Appreciate it.
And stay safe.
Yes.
You all stay safe as well.
Good night, everyone.